Ladies and gentlemen, anniversary celebrations of Abanindranath Tagore, Victoria Memorial Hall presents today's illustrated lecture by Arindam Chakrabarti, Professor of Philosophy, University of Hawaii. And the topic he's going to speak on is the nation and its art, why we cannot nationalize Abanindranath's philosophy of art. We are very grateful that Professor Tapati Guha-Thakurta has kindly agreed to chair this evening's session. So may I request you to kindly take your seat up here? Yes. And meanwhile, may I request all of you ladies and gentlemen to kindly put your phones on silent mode or switch your phones off completely. At the outset, I would also like to request Dr. Jayanto Sengupta, Secretary and Curator of Victoria Memorial Hall, to welcome the audience this evening before we get underway.
Thank you, Raju, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to our talk this evening, with which we are continuing to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Abanindranath Tagore. And all of you know that we are now perhaps the largest collection and the most representative collection of Abanindranath Tagore's works, essentially because we have the very famous Rabindra Bharati Society collection on enduring loan. And we have been celebrating this 150th anniversary since 2020 with various events, mostly online exhibitions and some talks. And Professor Tapati Guha-Thakurta, who has so kindly agreed to chair this evening, has been part of those earlier celebrations. But now, it's a real privilege and honor to have Professor Arindam Chakrabarti to speak on Abanindranath in what is going to be the first of a two-part series. Tonight, the first talk, The Nation and Its Art, Why We Can't Nationalize Abanindranath's Philosophy of Art. And then he is following up with a second talk on Abanindranath in Bangla tomorrow evening in Rabindra Sadan, which is organized by Anushtup Prakashani, in which he will speak on Eki Labonne, Abanindranath as Abanindranathir Shilpo ebong tar chobi lekha. So it's a real privilege and honor to have this Professor Chakrabarti. We have been planning this for nearly a year now, and it's finally happening. He is now a visiting professor for a few months at Ashoka University, so it's very fortunate that we can have him for a very short period in which he is delivering these two lectures. And it's a privilege and honor to have with us, as always, Professor Tapati Guha-Thakurta, who has braved various kinds of, difficulties and also illness to chair this session. So we have, I have nothing more to say. We are looking forward to a fascinating evening of conversations, of a talk, and then interaction on Abanindranath Tagore. So without further ado, I would request Professor Tapati Guha-Thakurta to introduce this evening and introduce our speaker. Tapati, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jayanto. Before Tapati starts the introduction, may I request Jayanto to kindly do the honors and on behalf of Victoria Memorial Hall, hand over a memento to the speaker of the evening and the chairperson for this evening. So with that, we hand over proceedings to Professor Tapati Guha-Thakurta to carry this forward. And of course, after you have introduced the speaker, Maybe if you want to see the slides, you may have to take a seat in front.
We'll do that. Okay. Thank you very much. It's a real privilege and honor to be chairing a session by Arindam. It's also a moment, as Jayanto said, to acknowledge that on Abanindranath 150th year, the paintings that were in the Rabindra Bharati Society collection for several decades have been digitized and have found a new home, even if it's a home that is on a long-term loan in the Victoria Memorial. I've often wondered what Abanindranath's reactions would have been to have known that his works are moving to the Victoria Memorial. But having said that, I'm sure he would have had a good laugh about this, because I don't think he would have wanted, recluse that he had become, I don't think he would have quite wanted his paintings to remain in the trunks in which they lay for several decades. That was part of a certain contingency of what happens, the afterlife of an artist and its collection. Because Abanindranath sold very little in his lifetime, and that's quite amazing, because whatever works he sold were in the very first years when Havel was one of the major patrons and actually acquired some of very fine early works which are in the Indian Museum collection. After that, occasionally his works were shown at the Society of Oriental Art and would sell, but not very many. And then there were several decades in between when Abanindranath, as I have argued, in a way retreats from public life. Even though he remains a public personality, he consciously steps outside the role that he had assumed in his early years. And that's when Abanindranath's works almost entirely exist within a personal domain. So some of his finest series from, say, 1912, 13, 14 onwards, Phalguni series, the Arabian Nights, the Mass series, Shahjatpur, and of course later the Kobi Konkon Chundi series, when he's changing his styles quite radically. And thereafter there are also gems like the Khuddu Jatra, which he's producing entirely for the family. Now these works were all with the family collection. What was also with the family collection was an extraordinary set of pastoral portraits. Abanindranath as a portraitist is less known, but I remember seeing a lot of it in the family collection with Badsha Thakur and with Biru Thakur. And again, these portraits were done almost entirely for the family. They have also now found their way into some collections. But the best of Abanindranath remained with Alokendranath Tagore, his son. And it was Alokendranath's decision to set up the Rabindra Bharati Society and hand it over to them, along with works by Gaganendranath, especially because the house, number 5, had been sold, we know, in Abanindranath's lifetime. And since then, since the 60s, that's where the best and the bulk of Abanindranath's paintings went. A small selection went to the National Gallery of Modern Art. I'm sorry for this diversion, but I think it's almost, when we think of how and where artists' works go, it's something that we've been thinking more and more about at a time when there isn't an art market. Where do artists' works go? And the fact that when the NGMA is setting up, Abanindranath's works are highly in demand. Abanindranath is still living then, and some of his works go there. But beyond that, Abanindranath's really didn't exist in any public collection. I remember seeing them in trunks when I was working on Abanindranath, and so has generations of scholars before and after me. It is only now that it is available for very close perusal because of the quality of digitization, but also because physically there needs to be a person from Rabindra Bharati Society present. But thanks to their relocation, it is possible to set up an appointment and actually take a look at his works very closely. I hope, though, that his 150th year has gone, but I do hope that some of Abanindranath will be on view in the public domain as part of an Indian painting gallery that has been planned for a long time. Now I must go on to introducing our very eminent speaker. I actually made a few notes because it was a 17-page CV that was shared with me, and none of you will be surprised by that. And that 17-page CV did not include also the bulk of Arindam's writings in Bangla. So I will not even try, therefore, and sum up all the wide range of his writings. I'll begin on a slightly personal note that Arindam was just a few years senior to me in Presidency College. I didn't realize that he was only maybe a year or two senior. I always thought of him as more senior and more eminent, but I do remember him very well from college. Then we overlapped briefly when I was in Oxford. He had finished his PhD by then. He had worked under Peter Strawson and Michael Dummett, as is well known. I don't know what, probably you were on a postdoctoral fellowship in the 80s?
Yes, Wolfson.
Wolfson, that's right. So I remember meeting Arindam very frequently in Oxford during those years. And those were the years when Bimal Krishna Motilal was also holding a very eminent position at All Souls College. So in a way, that's how far back my acquaintance with Arindam goes, to the 70s and then to the 80s. In between, I've kept up with the range of his writing. There was a time in between when he was a visiting fellow and attached to our institution. And one of my big takeaways from those months were the classes on Kant that Arindam would conduct, and which had several philosophy teachers from Calcutta University also attending it, and some of us, we learned how to read Kant with Arindam, and I will always treasure that education, even though it came very late in life. Arindam is currently Professor of Philosophy at the University of Hawaii, but he had moved a few years ago to an endowed chair in Classical Indic Studies at Stony Brook. He was there from 2018 and has now returned again to Hawaii, where he taught for several decades. He has a BA in philosophy from Presidency College, 1976, MA, Calcutta University, 78. My big question to Arindam was that we used to endlessly wait for our exams. So how come you managed an MA in 2 years? In our time, it took a year for our exam results to come out after our BA, and then only we could join. So it kind of practically stopped us from trying to go anywhere else. We were all bound to Kolkata because it took a year for our results to come out. And then again, of course, the process of it. But remarkably, Arindam's degree was in 2 years, and then he was in Oxford University, where he finished his PhD in 1982. Now, I made a brief list of Arindam's writings, and very brief this is, because I'm sure there are many others which are in the pipeline. I'll begin with a book called Knowing from Words, which he co-edited with Bimal Krishna Motilal. And it's part of a Synthese library series that he's been part of and writing in it. That's 1995. Then, if we were to go through some of his more recent books, Realism Interlinked, Objects, Subjects, and Other Subjects, London Bloomsbury, either 2020 or 21. This brings together most of his major essays on epistemology, metaphysics, and the philosophy of the mind. Blackwell's Source Book in Indian Philosophy, 2010, is another landmark work, which is very, very widely used, as is his book on Indian and Western philosophy that he wrote for Penguin. There's a a book of questions, an analytical introduction to Indian philosophy, which is still mentioned as forthcoming.
Yes.
Okay, so it is still forthcoming. In 2020, it was mentioned as forthcoming. Among his many edited and co-edited books, there's Comparative Philosophy Without Borders, Bloomsbury, 2017, the Bloomsbury Research Handbook on Indian Aesthetics and the Philosophy of Art, which I had the good fortune of contributing to, that came out in 2016. Apoha, Buddhist Nominalism and Human Cognition, Columbia University Press, 2011. Mahabharat Now, which he co-edited with Shivaji Bandyopadhyay, Narration, Aesthetics and Ethics. I think that's around the time when Arindam was at the center too. That came out from Routledge in 2014. I also know that Arindam wrote on Mahabharat along with Ganesh Pine's paintings. That was a very remarkable work that he did. But Mahabharat Now also carries a remarkable painting by Ganesh Pine on its cover. Then there's Engaged Emancipation, Minds, Morals, and Make-Believe in the Jogo Vashishta, which came out from the SUNY Press, New York in 2016. Now, I know I barely touched on a fragment of his writings. His articles run into several pages, and his Bangla writings also do. And I know that there's a new set of his essays which will be out with Anushtup very soon. With that, we are really looking forward to listening to him on Abanindranath. There are different ways in which Abanindranath Bageshwari Shilpa Prabandhavali has come up in his writings in different forms, including in his introduction to the book on Indian aesthetics and the philosophy of art. So we're really looking forward to hearing him in two parts, today's lecture, equally tomorrow's lecture. So over to you, and I'll go and sit there, and then I'll come.
Omkaranathaaya Vichitramurtaye Bhaktanuraktaaya Gurur Gariyase Shyamaya Shuklaya Niranjanayate Namostu Avarnaya Tamo Vinashine. In the meanwhile, the demon of barbarity has given up all pretense and has emerged with unconcealed fangs, ready to tear up humanity in an orgy of devastation. From one end of the world to the other, the poisonous fumes of hatred darken the atmosphere. The spirit of violence, which perhaps lay dormant in the psychology of the West, has at last roused itself and desecrates the spirit of man. I had at one time believed that the springs of civilization would issue out of the heart of Europe. And indeed, Tagore did write just half a decade before this essay, Crisis of Civilization, that I was reading from. The contact, he had written good things about Europe. The contact with Europe revealed to us Pashchimaji Khuliyache Dar. On the one hand, the universal laws of causality that govern the natural world, and on the other, the pure ideals of morality that cannot be constricted by the dictates of scripture or ritual tradition. With all our weaknesses, Tagore wrote at that time, the weaknesses of the Indians, we have been trying in our recent political life to bring about changes based on these ideals, mostly democracy. Yet in our families and neighborhoods, in our social lives, the ideals of individual autonomy and dignity or of the equal right to just behavior, irrespective of caste or class, have not fully entered our inner selves. But just before his death, he wrote, to continue the earlier quotation, I had at one time believed that the springs of civilization would issue out of the heart of Europe. But today, when I am about to quit the world, that faith has gone bankrupt altogether. As I look around, I see the crumbling ruins of a proud civilization strewn like a vast heap of futility. Obviously, the connection of these quotes is not to art but to nation. India did not need the West, right from Alexander the Great all the way up to Lord Clive, to have a rich tradition of art. But India did need the West to have the idea of democracy and the idea of a nation. And those two ideas have an interesting conflicting connection. As we see, if one of them is really honored, the other one should be a little bit, underemphasized, to put it mildly. So, I think we have good days for the nation now, and perhaps not so good days for democracy. So, I had wanted to give a summary of what I'm saying in the beginning, and basically I would divide my talk in 4 parts. The first part is about nation. What is a nation? The second part, of course, is we can't even begin to scratch the surface on that. What is art? From Tolstoy to Heidegger, everybody wrote about this. And of course, in the Atharva Veda, you have a very beautiful definition of art. And there is a little bit controversy about what is the correct term for art in Sanskrit. Abanindranath systematically uses the word shilpa for art. That's quite correct according to Sanskrit tradition, because the Atharva Veda says Atma Samskritir Vai Shilpani. So all the arts are ways of culturing the self. If we invent a verb like culturing, samskriti is refining the self. Atma samskriti, samskara, bhava, shilpani. So, first part is about what is nation, second part is about what is art, and of course the most important is the third part, why the marriage between nation and art can never be a happy marriage. And indeed, I'll glean from Abanindranath's flowing lecture. Actually, if you remember the image that even Calcutta University first publication mentioned, that he would come in a, if you think my dress today is flowing, it's nothing compared to what he used to come in. He used to come in a dressing gown and lecture. And it took for almost 2 years, or more actually, to deliver all the 28 lectures that he gave. And luckily, Ananda Publishers has this edition, Bhageshwari Shilpa Prabandhavali. In the original edition, it was called Bhageshwari for some reason. That is a mistake. And I had originally asked Calcutta University, somewhat shamelessly, that instead of celebrating 150 years, can you, on this occasion, revive the Bhageshwari lectures? And my late lamented friend Chopin had told me with realistic cynicism that this will not be possible. And it wasn't. So the question is, can art be national? Could there be a jati or shilpa? And Abanindranath's answer is an unequivocal no, which shows that in all the textbooks, research books, the mention of Abanindranath as the father of national Indian art, even at his own time, he knew that he was kind of trapped by that reputation. And my job today is to go into the intricacies of his arguments. So I'm afraid when we come to the real meat of the argument, I will have to read long extracts in Bengali, but then I've tried to summarize the main thing. So that's the third part. First part nation, second part art, third part why art and nation cannot be happily married, right? But the fourth part is about Abanindranath's own philosophy of art, okay? And there, my conclusion is out and out negative, in the sense, not that he didn't have a philosophy of art, but that squarely and solidly, we could say, there were many Abanindranaths. There are many, many different Abanindranaths. There is not one, okay? Which raises an interesting wrinkle, because one of the arguments he gives why art cannot be collectivized is from the, I call it the argument from individuality or personality of the artist. And not only did he, in his mask with the, we are all, it's quite an appropriate series to show now that we got used to the half mask. I don't know what Abanindranath would have said about masks due to the pandemic. But then, in the mask works, Abanindranath really plays with that original Latin origin of the word person, which comes from persona, which means mask. And there will be a lot of play between, at the heart of Bhageshwari Shilpa Prabandhavali, in these essays, there is an essay called Inner and Outer. It's a classic question, okay? Visual art, we don't have X-ray eyes, so although restorers of paintings try to sometimes see deeper and deeper into, that creates into an artwork, into the surface and all, and while we see the exterior, but then that exterior, for good art, is supposed to bring out the innermost thoughts of the artist, right? So the artist is a private person, but in the canvas somewhere, the artist apparently puts her or his innermost. But how can the in be so easily outed? So those are questions that Abanindranath deals with But then in the fourth part, my conclusion, I'm already, there's no suspense. Our great books don't believe in suspense. In the very first chapter of the Ramayana, the entire Ramayana story with the conclusion also is everything told. So don't read it for the suspense value. Not a plot summary only, details. And of course, Mahabharata is even more, artistic and in a very moving way. Within the first 3 chapters of Adi Parva, there is the entire story of the Mahabharata is told as a lament. Dhritarashtra's lament. It is from that lamentation summary of the plot that, again, recently passed away, that Shauni Mitro took that phrase. So that I still remember suddenly. This is what happens in old age. I can't remember recent things, but the old things, Mahabharata I must have read as a child or something. So there is this beautiful line in the middle of the story. The entire story is told by Dhritarashtra as a lament. So Dhritarashtra says, Yada Shrausham, when I heard, because he can't see anything, he hears, right? Right there is something happening there. That trope of, blind justice, blind affection, blind infatuation with his own son. How many layers of blindness? But he hears. Okay? He is a listener. And he is also very affectionate to his son. More affectionate than the mother. And of course, one term for caring service or taking care of somebody in Bangla and in Sanskrit means desire to listen. I'm talking about the word shushrusha, right? Shushrusha srotumicha. So a caregiver is somebody who wants to listen. So he said, Yada Shrosham, when I heard Draupadim Ashrukantim, her voice choked with tears. Sabam Nitam Nathavatim Anathavat Tada Anashangse Vijayaya Sanjaya. I knew there is no hope for our victory. Entire story is told with the refrain Tada Anashangse Vijayaya Sanjaya. The Mahabharata is just, full of ironies, explicit ironies. I think that should be the rasa of the Mahabharata, not even Shantarasa, but a certain kind of very refined humor. That's the Mahabharata's thing. Why? Because the book is called Jaya. Mahabharata is not name of Mahabharata. Mahabharata is called Jayakhya Samhita. It's called Jaya. The whole book is called Victory. Right? And in a crucial part in the southern recension of the Yaksha Prashna, of the dialogue with the crane in that, by the side of the lethal lake, right? Yudhishthira was asked, what is defeat? He was asked. And he said, winning. His answer was winning. Whether in a domestic fight with your partner or with your maidservant, to win the argument is to lose the partner or the maidservant. So, Jaya is the name. And it starts with Dhritarashtra saying, I never thought we shall win. And we know Yudhishthira wins. And we are sure, until the last chapter, Yudhishthira wins by his virtue, by his heavenly piety. He is a pious person. He is a moral self-questioner obviously he wins. That's the Jato Dharmas Tato Jaya. He's winning because of Dharma. But then in the last bit he loses because Duryodhana is in heaven before him. So, I wanted to tell you the entire plot of my thing, like Mahabharata and Ramayana. But I'm not going to go on for 100,000 verses. But the last part is called Abanindranath as uncategorizable. So, let me start with the nation. So, the best thing about this that I have found is Tagore's concept of nation, not the original book by Partha Chatterjee. Even he says that he has said it better in a Bengali book called Prajavatantra, but this essay is in English called Tagore's Non-Nation. So Tagore's Non-Nation. And roughly the idea is that the idea of nation is foreign to India. So Indian nation is an oxymoron. That's Tagore's opinion. But there is a notion of Swadeshi Samaj, which some people have, sort of post-Hegelians, have started trying to see civil society in it. But Swadeshi Samaj is not quite civil society. My Swadesh is something that I, along with others, create. You can inherit a nation. You cannot just inherit a Swadeshi Samaj. You have to make it. Everybody has to make it. So just by finding yourself born in a certain country, like parents, and then being made to feel great about the country, and to learn to say, this is particularly incoherent for us who, even in 75 years, we are celebrating with the tricolor. By the way, there is another figure in the tricolor, in our flag, which is that poor little chakra, right? Which is named after Ashoka. And there is more to Ashok than Shah Rukh Khan. So, I just read somewhere that that Savarkar used to believe that the Ashok that we should really swear by is Chandashok, before the Kalinga War, right? And in one of the pictures of Bharat Mata, so Abanindranath got hitched with this reputation of being a nationalist painter because of this painting, right? And if you just compare this Bharat Mata, which is supposed to be the source of the concept, with the white lotus underneath, and of course with no trident, no lion, but some rice plant, paddy plant, dhan. We all know about the Kolabau in Navaputrika in Durga Puja. So there are some plants in that inside. Okay, 9 kinds of trees. Kadali, Dadimi, Dhanyam, Haridra, Manakam, Kachu, Bilva, Ashoka, Jayanti cha, Vijñeya, Navaputrika. Dhanya Lakshmi. Lakshmi is worshipped in Dhanya. And Dadime, that is in pomegranate, you can imagine, which Devi? Raktadantika, because it looks like teeth soaked in blood. pomegranate bits. So, Dhanya Lakshmi. So, she has the white lotus of Saraswati and the Dhanya in her hand, but she has also a book. So, here is the manuscript, right? Nowadays, there's a name for that kind of stuff, and it's called soft power or something. No, there's another name. There is another name. Knowledge systems, Indian knowledge system. There is a different department, which I just learned in Delhi, has more budget than education department, which is called IKS, Indian knowledge system. So that knowledge system is there in the manuscripts. And of course, something that until recently we all needed, and Gandhi was, which is cloth, right? Something to wear. Now, but compare this image with this. This is Bharat Mata now, okay, with or without the tricolor national flag. So, I think there's no need for me to elaborate on this. The distinctions and the contrasts are quite clear, and flags are also kind of evolving futuristically. So, I want to quote a sentence. So, this is the closest that Abanindranath came to connecting the idea of my land. Okay, American song is there. This land is my land, right? My land. Apparently, Hopi Native Americans, Hopi Indians, they used to find it very strange that people would think of the land to be belonging to them, unless they were talking about little plots of lands, like this whole land belongs to the Ambanis and so on. But the Hopis thought, we always thought the land owns me. Okay? Because obviously, it's nourishing me and so on. So how can I own this land, the whole land? From Rhode Island to California, to Los Angeles, it's my land, right? How did it become my land? So behind the idea of nation, to put it very bluntly and quickly, is the idea of private property. That's where it comes from. And the best story, philosophically profound, and even children can understand, is the following story about private property. Right? Because from private property comes the concept of a citizen also. You don't have, unless you show what you own, you don't own yourself. Right? This is, in a very complicated way, connected to the question that Draupadi had raised about whether Yudhishthira had the right to pawn her or stake her as a pawn. And pawn actually sounds like pawn, right? In any case, why private property and how is that? What's the basis of that idea? Okay, as we know, second treatise on government by Locke. Okay, if you can mix your labor with the land, then that becomes yours. That's it. If you leave enough for the commons, that's the idea. By the way, even Marx kind of believes in that, although he is notoriously against, ultimately in the communism, against private property. But if there is any property, if anything belongs to me, the ideal theory is because I have contributed my labor into producing it. Okay? So, all the jeans that we buy from Gap or something, or Fab India, that doesn't sell jeans, right? But nowadays, I saw Delhi Khadi Gramodyog, the central next to Regal, CP, the Connaught Place Khadi Gramodyog, like 2 floors of just jeans. Right? Really national jeans. Like Gandhian Levi's. Right? I mean, you nationalize everything. So, the Bangladeshi workers in sweatshops are mixing their labor to that. So really, they own it, according to Locke. But these Native Americans, putting feathers and useless art. Please remember this phrase, useless art. So useless art on their headdresses and so on. They're kind of lazy, like the Hawaiians used to be lazy. As long as they have food, they're just enjoying singing away. So they're not mixing labor. So out comes from poverty-stricken England and Ireland, and France, all the white people come. They work very hard, both at tilling the ground and killing people. They're good at both. Tilling rhymes with killing. So, and then they own things. So here is the story, which takes us to the heart of private property. A rich landowner who has acres of land is brushing his teeth in the morning and looking at his own lawn. He finds a ruffian, an uncouth man with a shovel, digging away right in front of him. He said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm making my house here." He said, "How can you do that? That's my land. Who let you in? You should not have entered." He said, "I don't understand. How is it your land?" He said, "I inherited it from my father. My father gave it to me." "How was it your father's land then?" He said, "He got it from his father. My grandfather was a pioneer." "Oh, so it became your land because of your grandfather." So this man, stops. He's taking some break from his digging activities. And he asks, "So how did he own this land?" He said, "He fought for it." The man takes up his shovel and says, "I'll fight for it." That's it. Private property for you. Right? And that's the basis of a nation. Ultimately. Always. Now, how can art have anything to do with that? Slight difference of opinion between uncle and nephew, between Rabindranath and Abanindranath. Rabindranath dislikes the translation of nation as jati. Abanindranath uses jati as a translation of nation. Rabindranath has complex reasons. Of course, jati brings in the idea of caste. And when we call National Museum Jatiya Sangraha Shala, we don't forget that jati means caste. But there is another jati, genera, like what universals, they're called in Vaisheshika Samanyas, universal properties. Right? Nityatve sati aneka samavetatvam. That which is eternal, like Plato's ideas, concepts, and they're common among a multiplicity of different individuals, the commonplace. So this is where Bhageshwari Shilpa Prabandhavali, there's one chapter which is the basis of my entire lecture. It starts, Manush Shobrop ek rokomen noy. এক এক জাত এক রকম খাচ্ছে পড়ছে চলছে ভাবছেও। Then he says that jati, by jati I mean our own way of distinguishing, this is European food, that's European dress. Of course, for the average Indian male now, we have to again talk about genes to see what is actually Indian. From the nationalist times, from the times of Swarnakumari Devi and Kadambari Devi and all the Jodashako people who brought in modernity to Calcutta and to India, and the Parsis there. So it was always the keeping up of national traditions, whether in rituals or in attire, was outsourced to the women, always. So the women. Now, of course, you know, in every university and all, women are actually, as boys and men have started taking to a geopolitical this thing kind of thing, and of course Hrithik Roshan wears a big scarf all the time, like Indian traditions. But the women have become belatedly a little more cosmopolitan, which of course cosmopolitan just means American. And then, so he's writing food, clothing, and way of living. Basically, roti, kapda, makan. In that, we distinguish Chinese kind of house, Japanese house, very different. Okay, Keralian house, very different. But the problem is, and this was a problem metaphysically also, how large should be the class for the common characteristics of them to count as a jati, right? If you say, Indian nation, okay, why not European nation? But that sounds like not quite the same. European Union, an Indian nation, and within the Indian nation, South Indian. There is this category Bengalis have called South Indian, right? Like those South Indians, right? Which make great food, right? But the fact that the Malayali script and language is utterly, utterly, utterly different from Tamil, and Tamil and Kannada, South Indian music, if you go to Dharwad, South Indian music, national music, is not, the state is called Karnataka, but it is not Carnatic music. In Dharwad and center of Karnataka, it's all North Indian music, right? And of course, at one time, Kirana Gharana, like Abdul Karim Khan and all, they were steeped in Carnatic music, right? Now you have a, three-party conflict. North Indian, like Hindi speaking, Urdu speaking, and, like Tyagaraja, Dikshitar kind of music, Carnatic, and then Hindu Muslim, right? So, this wonderful song, our song archivist, Amlan, and I, after a long time, I talked to Amlan, and we both talked about one particular song, which is very, very clever. The lyrics are clever. The raga is also rare. It's called Shuddha Pilu. And the lyrics are just fantastic, right? You can say that about politicians also. The lyrics are Soch Samajh Nadan. Somebody who understands everything, but is very innocent. Right? Soch Samajh Nadan. Starts from the top, comes down. Who is singing Kirana Gharana? Abdul Karim Khan, Muslim, North Indian. But he also sings Neelambari, which is a South Indian raga. So there is this problem of, Abanindranath fearlessly uses the word, that once you start distinguishing nations, saying that in Tangra in Calcutta there is a small other nation, Kali worshipping Chinese people, right? Where the Alipur people go to have good, authentic Chinese food. But Abanindranath fearlessly says it will become a khichdi always. And yet it will give boundaries. So it's a notion. So that's the end of my nation part of the lecture. It's a notion that for different reasons, either positively because there is a notion of Swadeshi Samaj, or because skeptically, critically, Abanindranath's reason that yes, it is important. He will become much more trenchant once we come to the third part, which is why the marriage between jati and art can never be happy. But second part, what is art? I'll talk more about this tomorrow in Bangla in the Eki Lavanya lecture. But if we take the Atharva Veda translation of art as Shilpa, rather than the alternative candidate is Kala. So Tagore didn't call the art faculty Shilpa Bhavan, he calls it Kala Bhavan. You know. So what's the reason? What's the reason? Well, because Shilpa has also become the translation of industry. We call industrial revolution Shilpa Biplab. So if you have to bring it both into art, then Shilpa has a tendency to become artisans or, art, what's that word? Craft. Whereas Kala seems more kind of, the hallmark of, as I said, I like spoiling my own suspenses. So it's only at the end of the day today that I could come up with this simple form of the argument that Abanindranath makes, although he makes it in a much more Baroque fashion with many, many metaphors. And the form is very simple. My argument, which is a summary of his argument, is this. First premise, art must be useless. That's the definition of art. Art should be always useless. Okay? So the moment you are using an old Kalighat pot painting as a coaster to keep your hot cup of tea, you are basically disqualifying it. It's not an art. It's a piece of accessory, right? So it's something that you are using. You cannot use art, right? These two things are opposed to use, friendship and art. Okay? Yes, a friend in need is a friend indeed, but I heard America is quite eye-opening. First time I land in New York, I never studied in that country. I first time land, to join a visiting position in University of Washington, Seattle, and I landed in New York. And from the baggage claim, from the belt, a mother, looked like a single mother, with her child. The child is 4-year-old, and she has a big heavy purse. She tells the 4-year-old, "Hey, John, please hold this bag. I have to get my big suitcases out of the belt, that conveyor belt." And the boy, grumblingly carries the bag, but he starts howling. And I try to hear in the American accent, the boy is saying, "Mom, you are using me." Right? You can't use them because the relationship is of love, and love resists using. So art is like that. And here, Abanindranath is a sort of admiring follower of his uncle. Tagore theorized this by the very subtle concept of surplus in man. That there is a surplus. Surplus by itself, with apologies to Marx, surplus value and all that. But surplus is useless, right? And so the final argument is this: art must be useless. First premise. Second premise, nation is a multiply purposive, strategic, utilitarian, and massively useful idea. A good nation, democratically chosen government and all, that's supposed to be useful for all of us. It does some job. That's why there is. It's, as we know now, and for a long time in America, people said, it protects us from all those enemies everywhere. Because every neighbor, especially for countries whose dollar notes say, in God we trust. That's the dollar note says that. And then there is some Freemasonry symbols in the dollar note. Okay? With a pyramid with an eye on top. Nobody understands that. That's a secret society of Christianity. No, it is. It is. Freemasons are secret societies yet. And so, in that country, love thy neighbor as thyself. In God we trust. And neighbors are enemies. Of course, love thine enemies also. So, and some love is by kisses, some by bullets. So, it's the same. But it's like love thy neighbor with bullets. And the state protects us from all those. Okay? Terrorists everywhere now. Even in India, you have to mark between terrorists and real friends. And so, and the state does this job. So it's a useful thing. Even in a good way. I'm being sarcastic, but there is a lot of useful things. All the services and things like that. So even if it's not a welfare state, it is something that encourages us to be entrepreneurs and so on. So it is useful. So art is useless. Nation is useful from top to bottom. Hence, conclusion from these two premises, the marriage of art and nation is at best a marriage of convenience and at worst a recipe for a slow death of art. That's my total conclusion, very simple. Okay. Now, there are 4 arguments that in the essay Jatiyo Shilpo, Abanindranath gives. Okay. He writes, and this I translate from Jatiyo Shilpo, art could be called national, but in reality, art cannot be so. It is a wayfarer, always on the go. This is the last paragraph of Jatiyo Shilpo. Let me finish the translation and then I'll read the original. Neither. So, it is a wayfarer. It, that is art, does not live locked up in a national museum. Straightforwardly, Abanindranath says, the father of national Indian art. Neither is its path the broad main street marked by the chariot wheels of a nation god. Nor is its path some dark, narrow lane. From art's pathway, please notice, from art's pathway, an art's itinerary, the art's route, the way that art travels. And it travels all the time. It is never fixed. That's one of the arguments why it cannot be national. From art's pathway, all signposts and addresses have been erased. Art should not have an address. Awesome is its form, forever new and unprecedented. That will be another argument. Kshane, kshane, tan, navatam avaiti. It becomes every moment new. It doesn't ever get arrested, frozen, ossified, or categorized. আর্টকে বলা চলে ন্যাশনাল, কিন্তু আসলে আর্ট তা নয়, সে পথিক। তার বাসা জাতীয় আগারে নয়, তার পথ জাত দেবতার রথচক্র লাঞ্ছিত বড় রাস্তাও নয়, ছোট গলিও নয়। ঠিক ঠিকানা সব নিশানা হারানো তার পথ। বিস্ময়কর অপূর্ব দর্শন। That's how he ends. 5 arguments for why art cannot be appropriated by the nation. Quickly. Why the act of artistic creativity cannot be institutionalized. First argument. This is the argument from organic, dynamic fluidity of art, which is incompatible with an essentialist frozenness of a generic national stereotyping. That's pretty straightforward. For example, all Indian art must be spiritual. That's a stereotyping. Or somebody gets very Rajneesh inspired and says all Indian art must be lustful or karma based, because after all, our most artistic thing, as from Mira Nayar's film, is Kama Sutra. So that's a stereotype. Desire based must be all Indian art, either karma based or nishkama based. Both are to make it settle down and say this is Indian, anything else is un-Indian. There was, when Indira Gandhi was alive, and I had just joined Calcutta University as a lecturer, 83 or something. There was a conference on pluralistic culture and national integration in Shimla Institute of Advanced Studies. That the proceedings of that is published. It is possible to get it from Shimla, or, And I wrote a small paper which came out also. Big stalwarts were there at that time. One literary person called Bhisham Sahani was there reading a paper. So I wrote like a fool, a Socratic question, what makes us Indian? That's my title, what makes us Indian? And after considering many hypotheses and rejecting all of them, because of ativyapti or avyapti, there is some problem with the definition, I settled on the definition, intolerance of intolerance. What makes us Indian is that we don't tolerate intolerance. That's all. So that actually goes back to the Ashoka symbol. Ashoka also says that a particular religious sect, 14th edict, stone edict of Girnar. Ashoka has now, there are more than, previously there were 16, now 27 have been discovered, okay, all over the country, Ashoka's edicts. And in the 14th one in Girnar, Ashoka says openly that a particular religious sect, in fact every good city, he says, must have multiple religious practices. There should not, he's a Buddhist at that time, he's saying there should not be only Buddhists, there should be others. And a particular religious sect not only gets stronger by sitting in debate with other religious sects, but it gets weaker by praising itself. Okay? In neutral, quite secular way, he uses the word pashanda in that Brahmi script, but it's written in Sanskrit. Atma pashanda and parapashanda. Pashanda means dogmatic. What Ramakrishna called Mutuar Buddhi. Matua means my dogmatism. So every religion has that. Even Buddhists have that. Ashoka is saying that. He said, Atma Pashanda Prasangsa and Parapashanda Ninda is a sure recipe for weakening of your own religion. Right? So that's the symbol of our Ashoka Chakra. Right? Of late, of course, lions have become more important than the things. And I won't go any further in saying cute things, but you should remember this pride in the lions. You should just hear for the Punjabi pronunciation of lions. Then you'll see what one is really proud of. So the first argument was that the organic dynamic fluidity of art is opposed to the sort of freezing nature of reifying nature of essentialist nation idea. Second is argument from freedom. In traditional Indian theory of art, both in Chitra Sutra, which starts by this spectacular claim. So tell us, in Shukraniti Sar, this is where the structure of the last chapters of Bhagishwari comes from, because Chitra Sutra has this 6 parts, 6 angas of any art. Okay? And what are those angas that Rupa Bhedo Pramanani. So one is Rupa Bheda. Every painting must have difference of rupas, of forms. Rupa Bhedo Pramanani, measurements, proper proportions. Okay? If you are showing something in distance, then all of it should be small. Just because you like the person, you should not make their face very large, because that will look like he's closer. So, Rupa Bheda Pramanani, there should be Pramanani. And Bhava Lavanya Jojana. Adding Bhava and Lavanya. This Lavanya and Bhava I'll talk about tomorrow. And then there are two more which are actually from, what is? Sadrishyam Varnikabhanga. Sadrishyam Varnikabhanga. Those 6 they make. And at every point it is emphasized that about these matters, although there are niyamas, laws, and that's why in the argument from freedom, I want to very briefly to touch on the 4 moments with which the critique of judgment specifies the nature of aesthetic judgment as against determinative ordinary judgment. When we say that's a table, this is a tree, that's an oak tree, we make judgments, okay? That's determinative judgment. If I call it an oak tree, then I am making that particular, organic thing subject to or come under the description oak tree. And it belongs to the class of all oak trees. But that's not how, when I call something beautiful, suggestive, I appreciate, oh, what amazing, awesome, all sorts of chamatkar, all these adjectives we give to an artistic work of art, okay, mellifluous, if I'm listening to it. So, what is this? The first moment that Kant talks about is that it is universal without a law. There is no law. Right there, you cannot, although YouTube is full of it, how to become aesthetically appreciative. Learn art appreciation. That's like as farcical as all these courses all over America and American universities here. Creative writing teaching. Right? How to be creative. There are 5 steps to be creative. And if you have done the 5th step, you are already creative now. That's absurd. Why? Because as Magha, the Sanskrit poet says, this is niyati krita niyama rahitam. There is no niyama. There is no law. And yet, there is some expectation of agreement. Okay? I call people, other people. It's not just me alone. We don't go around saying, I like this, I don't know about you. That's not how art appreciation goes. You call people, have you heard that song? Isn't that beautiful? Did you see that painting? You are ready for slight disagreements, but you spill over and you share. So art is about sharing, but without law. That's the first moment. The second moment is, again, about freedom. Necessity without compulsion. That's actually the 4th moment. The second moment is purposiveness without a purpose. That comes to the uselessness of art, without a purpose. Why are you doing this? You see some Kashmiri shawls and some Edinburgh-made tweed. There is a particular weave, same color, no color difference. It's called the herringbone weave. You see that. You sometimes in Kashmiri, very soft kind of pashmina, you can't even notice it. Even the buyers who pay a lot of money, they don't notice it. Why do they put that in? No reason. That's art. Okay? And, corresponding to this, sculptures, right? You go to Halebid, Belur. The bottom row, which is almost covered by mud these days, has like 2,000 little elephants, each of them separately going there. Right? Why do you put them? What's the purpose? Is it following some scripture? No. It's the delight of the artist. And then in Ajanta, very regular creepers, the latas. Okay? Not just a hangsa lata with a shankha or something, which you see in alpanas also, but monkeys, pecking at mangoes. The monkeys in the middle of, divine damsels. There are these monkeys, right? So, why? No reason. But it is done very deliberately. It's purposiveness without a purpose. I'm, of course, simplifying things. So, all of this is based on the idea of free imagination. It is not only free from rules of the state, rules of your art teacher, okay, but it is free even from the requirement that it should be caused by something real. Why? Because the main thing, tomorrow I'll talk more about this, and Abanindranath, I think, has provided a definition of kalpana or imagination. Abhinav Gupta praises Saraswati as kalpana kalpavallim. Is a kalpalata of kalpana. She comes out every second with Saraswati, which Kant calls genius, in everybody. Everybody has a genius there. And it's coming up with more, every minute, new possibilities. But Abanindranath has defined kalpana, imagination, in a way that nobody could even imagine. He calls it in Bangla, kalpanar ki abiddamaner dirghosshas. It is the long sigh of that which is not there. Right? And that withdraws all restrictions from you. Anything you want. You can think of a magenta colored Tibra Nikhad. You can think of a very dishonest isosceles triangle. Kalpana can allow you to make category mistakes, not mistakes, just violate categories. But of course, there is that unteachable art of being able to pull it off. Not everybody can pull it off. But Sukumara, I did. Right? So, the third argument is that the individuality argument, the individual artists with their idiosyncrasies and whims establish and negotiate a personal relationship with art, and the individual himself may change beyond recognition from one phase of life to another. Like between the times when a music composer could hear, and after that same music composer goes deaf. Okay? The same individual has a different relationship with art. It's like, the same couple, who was it that Elizabeth Taylor got several times married to the same person, right? Right, Richard Burton, yes. And the individual himself may change. Or the art of Binod Bihari, before and after becoming blind. The Abon Thakur of Budo Angla is not the Abon Thakur of Raj Kahini. Okay? You can sniff some nationalism in Raj Kahini, in the story of Shiladitya, Bappaditya and so on. But not in Budo Angla. It's very hard to give a sort of patriotic interpretation of the journey of Hridoy, that selfish, quite mean child. The Abon Thakur, who engages in nostalgic chatting, purposeless chatting, killing time with Rani Chanda in Gharoa, and the Abon Thakur who writes Bharat Shilpi Sharango, they're different individuals. The Abon Thakur of Death of Shah Jahan, with which we started, and the Abon Thakur who invents the genre of mask portraits. Are masks inner truths? Let's see some of them now. This is our Indian art, Abon Thakur. What is the genre? What is the technique? Could you say that you add Okakura's Japanese technique with Mughal paintings and throw in a Rembrandt there and you get that result? I don't think so. You cannot. There is no way of getting this like an algebraic equation by putting values on different parts. And this is Abanindranath, vintage Abanindranath. Okay? And this is, of course, cosmopolitanism. Sindbad, who, like the artist, is always floating and he's journeying, he's a constant nautical life. He's floating, he's rowing a boat and going in a ship. But he meets this guy who is like Lord Nelson or, like a British guy. And there is an African, right? African Muslim, very old man, and of course there is an Asian person here, and all sorts of people. There are paintings like that where Shah Jahan actually is, or maybe it was Jahangir. Tapati will know this. He sits on a hourglass. There is a Mughal painting of Shah Jahan sitting on time, hourglass, with all sorts of cosmopolitan ambassadors and emissaries from different countries. So Abanindranath was very much taken by that. And then we come to the most mysterious painting. It's from the Arabian Nights. So I'm now switching over gradually to my fourth part. But let me finish. I'll come back to this individuality argument, and the concept of individual, the same individual, will have to be deconstructed. We'll have to rethink, is it the same Abanindranath? Because the argument was that it is the individual who marries art. And Abanindranath will say that nation cannot be the mother or the lover of art. Why? Because he says the nation is not the mother of art. Art does not fall in love and secretly marry a nation, like Dushyanta did to Shakuntala. Gandharva, arteর সঙ্গে জাতির গান্ধর্ব বিবাহ হতে পারে না. And unless গান্ধর্ব বিবাহ হয়, there is no creative exuberance. It is always an individual artist with whom art has that sort of amorous, unofficial liaison or affair. In spring, he continues, flowers blossom abundantly. The trees of a garden are in full bloom. Looking at that, it is a gross mistake to take the proprietor of the garden, the nation, to be the flower creator. After all, how can you forget things like God of spring, Vashantir Devata, Mother Earth, and that balmy southern breeze? By the breath, poo, he uses the word poo, by the breath of nationhood, the glory and the prestige of a country may go up and flare up. But no flower, not a single bud, opens its mouth by such exhaled wind. Even in the national park, and he uses in Bengali the word national park, even in the national park contrived by the nation, flowers don't bloom by the blowing of breath by any state power. Not by the... So the urgency and the anxiety with which good artwork is produced by sleepless maverick work all night, all day, the kind of work that took in the hot sun of a part of France where with his canvas every day Van Gogh will go and the heat will beat down on him, and his yellows will become madder and madder. That kind of impetus doesn't come from patriotic paranoia about people are going to attack us. It never. Art gives rise to art. Okay? But then we'll have to. Then finally, there is a fourth argument, the global human universality of the search for beauty. The search for beauty is common. But what's going on here is not just a general search for beauty. It's very hard to say. Jayanto was telling me that Shivakumar gave a talk especially on this. So this is supposed to be Arabian Nights. Now, Arabian Nights are not happening in 19th century. But here, what is this? It's a singer sewing machine. Singer sewing machine. My mother had one, which my daughter has now inherited. Okay? How did that come in the Arabian Nights? Right? And then there is a totally useless, jobless, completely unemployed entity. A cat. A cat. What role does it have? And then there is a man with Gandhi topi. And then, in the behind scene, of course, the spatial allocation, the topography of this particular small painting is just like the time rolling kind of paintings in Mughal painting and Rajput painting, where even some Krishna painting and Pahari painting, you see sequences of like one part of the canvas or the paper would show one event in time 1 and time 2, time 3, all of them will be in the same one. So this is what he's doing. And then he's suddenly bringing the past of Arabian Nights to his contemporary, his great-grandfather's business. Here is Dwarkanath Thakur kind of figure in Arabian Nights. And what is he doing? He's whining and dining a Mem Sahib and a Sahib. There's a British guy and his wife, white people. They're being treated well by who? So that he makes this company of shipping company, Kar and Tagore and company. What kind of Arabian Nights is that? What nationalism is going on here? None at all. It's going on individuality, quirkiness. That's what is going on. And that brings me to the fourth point. The unlocalizability or addresslessness argument. Okay? So he comes to the series of masks. I talked already about it, inside and outside. A commentator, I find the book a little bit too kind of postmodernism or French philosophy showing off, but it's a good book by Debashish Banerjee on alternate nation, Abanindranath Tagore, where he talks about these mask paintings, and I think it should be read with the lecture in Bageshwari Shilpa Prabandhavali on inside and outside, Antaro Bahir. But Debashish makes a very interesting point that Tagore is shown to be blind here, because at that period, Tagore is kind of like an ostrich. He has not yet written Crisis of Civilization, but he has his Shantiniketan idea, so he's going ahead with Vishwavarati, and but he is not receptive of other ideas. At this point, Abanindranath being much more of a Sanskrit scholar, he studied in Sanskrit college, and all of Bageshwari Shilpa Prabandhavali is full of Sanskrit quotations, and he knew actual, official Pandit type Sanskrit better than Rabindranath. And but Abanindranath has an idea of himself, which this kind of, he did many self-portraits. This is one of them. And finally, this is a real shocker, and this is quite common. He starts in his middle period, this Krishna Lila, this is Krishna Lila. So it's the most recognizably Hindu Vaishnava paintings. Gita Govinda paintings, Krishna Lila painting, Vaishnava Padavali paintings, depicting, illustrating Vidyapati, Chandidas, Radha Krishna Lila. There's nothing more radically un-Islamic than Krishna Lila. Right? In every register, okay, worshipping idols, having affair with, somebody who is not your wife, all of this. And this blue god. And he depicts that with full devotion. Abanindranath was a Vaishnava. I mean, his thing on Rasa starts with quotation from Rupa Goswami, the Lavanya, from Ujjwala Nilamani, which is Rupa Goswami's text. But then, all the texts and the writings of this series is in this peculiar script, which is Bengali, written like Farsi. And he signs all the Hindu paintings, not with Devanagari, as he signs other paintings. He writes Avanindra like Farsi, like Alif Be they say. Okay, that's his. But then Abanindranath is uncategorizable. Towards the end of his life, he does some odd paintings. You can see this is signature in Devanagari. But then he writes a Bengali, little sort of doggerel, Dasharathir Rani Hoi, Shohagini Koi Koi. Okay, a pun on Koikei. It looks like Dasharath and Koikei in their old age. I would leave it up to you as to how to interpret these two teeth jutting out from Koikei's mouth, right? I'm sure it's old age. But it somehow seems to be the face of a greedy person, right? A little mouse-like, rat-like. So this is one of his paintings. And this is, Tapati, which series is this? Arabian Nights. Arabian Nights. Bhattri right? But the story is not from Arabian Nights. Right. Bhattri Singhasan is from Vikramaditya. So he's like totally mixing up things. Like a happy khichdi cook. And then there was the stereotype that all Indian line drawings are rounded and wavy, and what in Sanskrit is called pelava. I said, okay, you think we are all pelava? I'll do angular. Now, here the lines are angular. All of them, line drawings. It's hard to recognize that this is by the same person who did Abhisarika in his youth. This is the kind of portrait he can do of Tagore. Okay, that's totally European style. Nothing Chitra Sutra about it. But then, he also does the same man, Tagore, as a baul, Rabi baul he calls this. And this is my last slide. But I do want to say good things and quote Devashish's interpretation of his last whims of the last 10 years. Going back to my central argument, art is useless. The notion of social uselessness, I'm reading from Devashish's book, this Alternate Nation, Devashish's book. The notion of social uselessness was not new in Abanindranath, as we have seen it in a generalized and performative way in the peripheral ontology of the flaneur. This is, Walter Benjamin's notion of the flaneur, who looks around, no purpose, he doesn't buy anything, but he goes around in Paris arcades looking at things and watching people, and he has no particular agenda, purposeless to the maximum. But he says, whereas this exercise of defined autonomy. Then he ends by saying, in the new constitution of the modern nation, Devashish says, and of the tightening systematicity of world politics and global capital, the artist could exist only through conformity to the fragmented ontology, and Abanindranath's communitarian identification thus shifted to the deep subalternity of inanimate refuse. So, waste, that which people throw away. So that explains the kutum, katam, or katam kutum. That's the end of his uncategorizability. But the actual address of Abanindranath, you can't tell. Is this the Volga, or is it the Ganges? Is it Indus? Or is it a small Rupnarayan? Is it, where is this? You can't tell. But you can see the balding man, the artist sitting there, an artist who divided himself into an author of Khirer Putul as well as the author of Bharat Shilpe Sharango, as a painter of Shah Jahan's death, as well as a painter of Krishna Lila, annotated in Persian looking Bengali. That's where we can find him always floating and traveling. And that is not allowed by the nation. Thank you. জয়ন্ত কোথায়? জয়ন্ত আচ্ছা 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 বলো, সময় অনেক হয়ে গেছে। Yeah, okay. Okay. Let's take 4 questions.
Okay.
Just
And
hardly
can I
2.
make a few
Yes,
comments,
please. Yes, please.
if at all there's time for it? Okay. Let me begin by something that you said right at the beginning, and then maybe disagree with the position on 2 levels. First is, so let me just bring it down to 2 very, very basic arguments that you've made, which is that Abanindranath genuinely believed in the uselessness of art, that art should not have any functional or utilitarian value, and the day art assumes, it ceases to be art. So in Abanindranath's own thinking, there's a very, very distinct difference, therefore, between karigori and যেটাকে উনি নিজে শিল্পীর কাজ বলছেন। So there's a very, very distinct distinction. When he's looking at Mughal miniature painting, he's admiring the karigori, but he's saying what it lacks is bhab. So he's bringing that in. Now you began by saying that had the British not come, India would still have had art, but it would not have had ideas of nation and democracy.
Yes.
But if we were to argue and say that Abanindranath's notion of art is highly rooted in a certain Western romantic and later modernist notion of art practice.
Yeah.
Now, he's also a Sanskrit scholar, but the basic notion of art that he's working with, and precisely an art that must free itself from nationalist fetters, is ultimately a romantic and later a very modernist notion of
Art for art's sake.
art for art's sake, but also the role and vocation of the artist itself. So যখন উনি ওই 3তলা বাড়ির কথা বলছেন, নিচে কারিগররা, মাঝের তলায় শিল্প রসিকরা, আর একদম ওপরের তলায় শিল্পী নিজে। শিল্পীর কিন্তু কারিগর আর রসিকদের প্রয়োজন নেই, কিন্তু প্রয়োজনও আছে।
আচ্ছা,
যে কারণে ওপরের তলায় উনি নিজেকে বারবার করে টেনে নিয়ে যাচ্ছেন। So I want to say that there is that ultimate.
সাধারণত তো মানে গ্রাউন্ড ফ্লোর আর দোতলা না থাকলে তিনতলা থাকতেই পারে না।
থাকতেই পারে না, কিন্তু but this idea that you needed to extricate yourself. So in Abanindranath's own work, he is turning to craftsmanship, to workmanship at many, many levels, especially when he's studying miniature painting.
Yes.
But he's also nonetheless espousing a notion of art which would have been almost impossible to think with in a pre-colonial period, where art has very, very distinct functions.
Yes.
Whether sculpture, architecture or painting, all have very, very distinct functional roles, however which we must. So in some ways to read Abanindranath's Bageshwari Shilpa Prabandhavali is to also engage with his own way of engaging his Sanskrita aesthetics with a very romantic and modernist notion of art. So that's one thing I wanted to hear back from you. The other is, of course, something that you've repeatedly brought us to think about is the many Abanindranaths that exist in writing, in painting, in his aesthetics. The one, far too much time has been spent on Bharat Mata. I think it's an overrated painting, and whether Sister Nivedita really wanted it used in processions from Kanyakumari to Kashmir, I doubt it. I wanted a source for that quotation.
Right.
Sister Nivedita is writing about many other paintings too. I feel that the one very important romantic nation that Abanindranath is espousing in the early years is the idea of the Mughal nation. And I would like to see that taken more seriously. His Persianate Islamicate culture, along with Sanskrit, his use of the Nationalist script when he's doing Bodhaboli. But if you think of that trilogy of the building of Taj Mahal, Shah Jahaner Mrityu, and also Shah Jahaner Taj Mahal Nirman Shopno.
Right, right.
The
That
trilogy,
dark painting.
that dark painting, where it is ultimately Japanese Nihonga style, where it appears as a speck. And if you were to read these three, very early example of history painting in a miniaturist style, and to that if you add Head of Dara, and in the 20s, Alamgir, a painting nobody remembers, it's in Kala Bhavan, a large triptych painting. I think there's a very, very distinct sense in which Abanindranath, against, at that time, the current of the times, is looking back to Mughal India with a certain admiration, romance, and a sense of history. We don't have history painting in India. We have Ravi Verma, who brings mythology into history. I feel Abanindranath's Mughal series should be seen as an early example of history painting, where he's using the style of the miniaturist, but he's interpreting Mughal history in a way no Mughal miniature painter would have. So I also wanted to think about what is this role of a miniaturist that Abanindranath, along with a storyteller, that Abanindranath is creating for himself.
Yeah.
There his art has a purpose. His art is about storytelling. So there I would like to say that what he's writing in Bageshwari Shilpa Prabandhavali, and if you look at the flow of his works, right into the Kalketu Phullarar Golpo, into the Krishna Mongol series, ultimately it's the power of storytelling. And he's telling it in different ways, from Kalidas's Ritu Shambhar to Kalketu Phullara's story, which of course Debashish has also been writing about. Through every mask is the story of a performance.
Yes.
I think Debashish has been able to unravel each and every one, the performance behind every mask. And he's actually using Shishir Bhaduri to it. I like to think that even the Alamgir painting is perhaps can be placed next to Shishir Bhaduri's playing the role of Aurangzeb Alamgir. Jodunath Sarkar writing on Aurangzeb, 1920s. I think this is the kind of Abanindranath's counter nation that I think today we have to think very critically about. And of course his Arabian Nights marvel, where he brings it into his own time. He does not follow any storyline. He creates his own he follows Burton, but he creates his own entire own storyline. So I would say, as a raconteur and as a storyteller, where writer and painter speak to each other, for Abanindranath, the primary function of art was to tell a story. And so I wanted your response to that. In that sense, he's talking about, you know, the absence. So in a way, in Bhageshwari Shilpa Prabandhabuli, he is actually talking about a certain aesthetic, but his paintings are actually pulling in very, very different ways all along. So just like we have to think of many Abanindranath, Bhageshwari Shilpa Prabandhabuli is a particular aesthete, brilliant set of lectures between 1923 and 29. But then if you think of Abanindranath's later story, the Chojjodli Golpo, Mashi.
Mashis.
You know, he's moving into absurdity in
Yeah.
a certain kind, right? He's looking into grotesque humor. Shankar Ghosher famous যে বইটা পরের দিকের অবনীন্দ্রনাথের লেখা নিয়ে তো যথেষ্ট কাজও হয়নি না
Right, right.
So I just wanted to therefore complicate this story about Abanindranath rejecting any functional purpose of art, or the fact that art যে দেশীয় যেটা
Let me
the
try to
same
respond.
জাতি.
Let me try to
These
respond.
are the two things I
Right.
really wanted to bring.
Actually, both of these could be answered in a sort of short, brief, slightly evasive way by appealing to many Abanindranaths. So, and I could say that which you are saying this is real, that's not so. So that's, but the disagreements are very clear. One is about my initial claim, which is not Abanindranath's claim, that we had art, we didn't have good politics or good ethics, but Europe did not. Abanindranath is never saying, and if I follow him, that we would have had art if we just stuck to the pre-colonial art practices, whether they're Islamic, Mughal, or this thing. He says that we would not have, because he doesn't want art to stop either with the pre-colonial or with the post-colonial. He just wants it to go on flowing. So that is perfectly compatible with saying that in this particular set of lectures and in this, I have overemphasized the uselessness argument, which is what your second disagreement is about. He does that. That is, one Abanindranath does that, but not all of them. Okay, but I want to give a slightly more technical answer to this question of purposelessness. There is a distinction that in philosophy, technical philosophy, in ethics, meta-ethics, we make between act and rule. So there are these conflicting ethical rules, ethical theories, consequentialism and sort of Kantian principled ethics. So consequentialism says an act is good if it has good consequences, if it makes people happy. That's John Stuart Mill Bentham. Kant and the anti-consequentialist says consequence has nothing to do with this. It has to do with the principle, from which the act is duty for duty's sake and so on. This debate between what we call deontology for Kant and consequentialism. There is nice solution of that by saying somebody, unlike Abanindranath, can paint, and each of those works of art can be purposeless. But he could have a purpose of why he is doing these purposeless paintings. So he would be an act purposeless, but the general practice has a purpose. So I can answer it by saying, when he sees that a certain trend is going, in fact, if one has to, it's like the Buddhist apoha, what is common among all horses? The Buddhists say there's nothing in common among horses. The only thing common is that each of them is a not non-horse. They're not non-horses. That's all that is common. Abanindranath is like that. He's contrarian. The only thing common among all the Abanindranaths is that whether it is in Jorasanko or outside, whether it is Stella Kramrish who is, dedicating her book of translation of, Chitra Sutra to Abanindranath, if you give him an award for something, he would do the opposite later on. It seems pretty clear to me. So That explains why we could have a very fruitful and juicy disagreement by taking different Abanindranaths. It's not because you and I disagree, it's because Abanindranath disagrees with himself. I think we should stop now, right? Is there? I think between the lateness of time and the traffic and my speech,
No.
people have lost their questions.
No. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Arindam, for this really, counterintuitive interpretation of Abanindranath's works and giving us so much food for thought. It's been a fascinating examination of Abanindranath's work. Thank you so much, Tapati, for agreeing to introduce and placing, and placing some more probing questions, which are, I think, the jury will be still out on these disagreements. And thank you so much for being here tonight. And on behalf of the Victoria Memorial as well as Anushtup, I would request all of you to attend tomorrow's talk by Arindam as well in Bangla. In Rabindra Sadhan at 5. So we have, and we really hope that Professor Arindam Chakrabarti develops all of this in a new book, which will be an apt act of celebrating the 150th anniversary of this great artist. So thank you so much again for coming here and supporting us. Thank you. Good evening.